Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am March Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome back our guest, Dr. Nancy Hillman. So, Dr. Hillman, thank you and welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Arch. Thank you.
Dr. Hillman is a professor at Moravian College, specifically American history, and she has done her doctorate dissertation on drawn apart black and white Baptist churches in the Tidewater, Virginia, from 1800 to 1875. And in our first program, Dr. Hillman had spoken to our listeners about Nat Turner's rebellion and the consequences of that, particularly in the churches. And she was able to speak on the Emancipation Proclamation and then the Gettysburg Address and the importance of both of them, particularly for the federal troops and Abraham Lincoln, and then the process that Lincoln was going through, changing the demeanor of the war from not only preserving the Union, but also to end slavery. And Nancy, before we get right back into your topic, I ask you to share with our listeners the experience that you have, because your courses are online courses. And what's the dynamics of that, and how does that work for we from an old generation who had never experienced taking online courses?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying there is no substitute for in-classroom learning, face-to-face learning. And I know that's what most students would prefer to do, and me as an adjunct instructor would prefer to do that, being in person, because of the give and take between getting to talk to between professors and students is wonderful. And you can't really replicate that in the online space. But that being said, in today's world, I think the demographic for higher education is changing very rapidly. In terms of people who may not have been able to pursue an advanced degree maybe a few decades ago based on either a financial situation or their time having to work full-time and not being able to attend school during the day, online courses have offered this wonderful opportunity for different kinds of people to pursue college degrees who, again, have to work during the day and may need to just take a course or two on the side in the evening or in their own timing. So online courses are great in terms of that convenience factor. I know for me personally, teaching online does also have a convenience factor of getting to be at home a lot and getting to record videos and meet with students over the computer. But what I try to do as an online instructor, because I do so much value classroom learning, is I try to do my utmost to make my courses rigorous as they can be, and standing up alongside live courses. And both myself and then Moravian has a team of instructional designers, which are wonderful, and they kind of come at it from the more technical standpoint. How do we create and shape these online courses to work well for students? And I've tried in partnership with instructional designers to make my lectures more interactive than just a student sitting in front of a video and just kind of listening passively. My lectures have questions embedded in them which will pop out at various points, and then a student has to pause and then type an answer to the question, much like if I were standing in front of a classroom or walking around the classroom and just asked a question in the middle of a lecture, pausing for a mini discussion. These little pop-out questions offer an opportunity for students to put their own voice in, and I can read those answers later on. So,
do you feel that online courses through colleges are growing in number, or are they something that it's relatively new and it's become static?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on the degree. So, for instance, nursing and business, I think, are two of the top areas where online courses are really taking off, particularly at places like Moravian. I think that the courses that I teach are not, they can be taken by history majors, but of course we'd want history majors as much as possible to be in the classroom, doing that give and take with the professor. So a lot of the students that I have are students who are pursuing kind of the gen ed for their degree in nursing or for business, or I have many students in the sciences, biochemistry, biology, all kinds of fields that are just looking to get that credit for a humanities course like history. But I do see, I think, a growth in the interest in online courses like mine to be able to fulfill those general requirements online if these students are pursuing maybe a degree in nursing, and they're trying to do as much of it as they can, either at night or online.
And in our first program, you were talking about Nat Turner's Rebellion and then the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. Would you briefly review the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, and then begin to speak to our listeners about in Chapter 6 of your book, Black Churches, what was going on in Black churches during the Civil War?
Great, yeah. So we had talked about kind of the sequence of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862 following the Battle of Antietam. And most scholars would agree that that was in many ways a diplomatic and political move, because what he was doing was effectively then making slavery at the center of the war. Whereas before, Lincoln's view was preserving the Union as the goal. He didn't like slavery. He was strongly opposed to slavery spreading into the territories, but his goal was preserving the Union, and he was willing to allow slavery to continue if that could preserve the Union. Now at the Emancipation Proclamation, what he's realizing is diplomatically, countries like England are never going to come in on the side of the Confederacy if we make this maneuver to make the war effectively a fight against slavery. So diplomatically, it was a really brilliant move to prevent international aid to the Confederacy. But more and more, I see Lincoln, his views changing, or at least perhaps he's allowing even more of his personal beliefs about slavery to come to the surface and viewing the war as, no, actually, slavery is at the heart of this war. It always has been. It was always at the heart of the conflict between North and South from the days of the Declaration of Independence. And here he is issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which became official in January of 1863. I should pause as a side note also to just kind of make sure folks, when they hear the Emancipation Proclamation, I think some people think, oh, yeah, that was when Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, we have to be careful in understanding exactly what it said. It said to free the slaves in the states which are in rebellion. So Maryland, slaves in Maryland, slaves in Kentucky, in some of those border states that were still loyal to the Union, those enslaved people would not have been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But it is a first step, a very significant first step in rolling back slavery. So by November of 1863, following months after the Battle of Gettysburg, when he's dedicating the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, and he gives this famous, wonderful 2-minute short address, he's really defining the meaning of the war. And he says a new birth of freedom. That, you can look at that and say, wow, like that is quite significantly different from saying at the beginning of the war, if I could preserve the Union and free some of the slaves, or free one slave, or free none of the slaves, I would do that. Now he's talking about this new birth of freedom. It's like he's defining, no, this war, as I had mentioned, has always been about slavery, and now we're going to advance the cause as the cause of freedom for all Americans. So basically, when I connect that to my own research, what I see in the Tidewater region, that is Eastern Virginia, and in particular the peninsula that goes, like if you move eastward from Richmond down the peninsula, Williamsburg, Yorktown, all the way down to Hampton on the Chesapeake Bay, the Emancipation Proclamation, real significance for those people living down there that realized more and more that running to the Federal Army would mean freedom. And I think that they had already started, enslaved people in that region had already started to understand that. There are places like Fort Monroe that the Union Army held for the duration of the war, and black people were flocking to places like Fort Monroe, causing federal officers to think about what is going on here and what do we do with these freed people. How can we even in some way use them to our advantage against the South? And so there was a whole lot of people's views and beliefs and interests in the mix here. But for the former slaves, they're seeing it as an opportunity now to run to the Federal Army to gain their freedom, and then in some cases to either work for the Federal Army or for men to enlist as soldiers in some cases, and really, I think, more and more causing Lincoln to think about what is the meaning of this war and how are these black people essentially asserting themselves and declaring their own freedom by running away.
And your dissertation, which you are working on to become a book, one of the wonderful things that there is that you are reminding us, Nancy, that as we study this physical world around us and we trying to figure out what went on in that particular time period, there's a whole other world, a spiritual realm that's going on that oftentimes many of us as historians overlook. Mm-hmm. And so share with our listeners, please, what is going on in the spiritual world, particularly in the Black African-American churches during the war.
Absolutely. Well, it's really in many cases just heartbreaking to think about the racial divisions that existed in the churches before the war, during the war, after the war, and still to today. I'm sure many folks have heard that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. At this point, we do see so much racial division in churches today, and a lot of that traces back to this period and the idea that Black people, in many cases, didn't feel included in religious participation with whites. They were always viewed, in many cases, as Christian brothers and sisters, but they weren't given the same, even we talk about rights in political society and in social society, and in religious circles, they weren't given, for instance, rights to vote in church issues where whites, and I'm talking particularly about white men here, voting on church policies, on discipline issues. In many cases, even physically, Black believers were pushed to the back or the balconies of churches more and more. That also is a complex topic because you can see in some cases that Blacks preferred that. They preferred to sit together as a group, but the idea that they're being excluded or feeling excluded and then eventually leaving the interracial churches after emancipation in droves, it's heartbreaking to think about all the missed opportunities for religious fellowship across racial lines, which of course is what Jesus speaks to, is true fellowship, is throwing down any barriers between people that come together as Christians. And that really, in many cases, and in most cases, wasn't going on in these Baptist churches. Now, my dissertation does focus on certain areas where that did exist before the war, during the war, and even after the war in some small pockets and some small circles. We do see interactions between Black and white Baptists that were cordial, congenial, and even, you could say, extending that right hand of fellowship to each other. But more and more, we just see these divisions occurring because of how Blacks are treated in the political and in the social realm, and that just ripples into the spiritual fellowship. So it's a real tragedy that so much potential for religious interaction and for true fellowship was just lost because of racism and the institution of slavery. And then Blacks really carrying the scars of that into emancipation. And specific cases after specific cases where, they're just mistreated in terms of now they're free people even. And some of the white leaders in the churches are still not wanting to grant them equal access in terms of church government. So more and more you see Black people drawing away from the interracial churches and forming their own churches. And you see that more and more. That had been occurring particularly in urban areas before the war, but that increases greatly after emancipation. So again, in terms of the spiritual, it is just a real tragedy in American history that Christians, and I say in particular white Christians, allowed this to happen and supported the institution of slavery, supported this categorical racism and viewing another person as less than themselves. That is a real tragedy.
In the areas where there were in Black churches, particularly in the southern states, the Confederate states, the Confederate Army would come through. Would they treat the Black churches and the physical building a lot differently than the white churches in those regions?
Yeah, that is a great question. I haven't found evidence of that either way. I do have one Black church, I think it was in the Suffolk area, that was used as a hospital because that whole region was just back and forth throughout the war. I think many people who study the Civil War don't realize some of the lesser engagements that occurred in the South Side area, like below the James River, and then on the peninsula. The Civil War was made up of hundreds and hundreds of these tinier engagements that went on all the time. And some of these churches were used as hospitals again and again, or they were just shut down because the area became too violent. In places like Hampton, the Confederates actually burned Hampton as they were leaving very early in the war, with Fort Monroe being occupied by the Federal troops. Hampton really wasn't going to remain Confederate, and they just left it, but burned it. And a lot of that, there was a huge church in Hampton that I think was like 90% black. And that church just kind of broke apart, and the whites kind of went one way, and after the war they kind of regrouped and formed their own church, and the black church effectively consolidated and formed this very vibrant black church in Hampton. But I don't see the Confederate Army really being destructive to black churches as kind of a military engagement, but we do see arson happen a little bit in certain areas like Petersburg and in Richmond, right toward the end of the war, or maybe even after April of 1865, there were a few black churches that were burned. And it was clear that this was the result of arson. I think one of them in Richmond was burned right around a celebration of Emancipation, that there was, I think the black community was celebrating the war and Emancipation, and the church was set on fire at some point. So there is some hostility, even violent hostility, amongst local whites toward black churches, particularly after the war. But for every example I give you, I can give you other examples that were different.
Right.
I saw so many other examples of then whites coming together with blacks to help rebuild those churches and to support those churches in those urban areas and to really go against that tide of racism. So you see there's so many complicated examples. I see churches that are splitting up across racial lines after the war, but it's somewhat cordial, which is very mysterious. So there's a kind of, okay, we're going to agree to split apart, but whites are going to let's help set up this church. You know, they even in some cases give the blacks the former church buildings. You want to say give, because if the blacks had been attending that church, that was as much their building as the whites. But you see the whites saying, okay, we're going to go off and build a new structure. We're going to agree to either give this building to you or sell it to you at a reasonable rate or something, and the black church makes the payments and then essentially takes over that space. I even see white leaders helping to ordain black pastors because they viewed the apostolic chain of a minister should only be ordained by another ordained minister. And so there weren't that many ordained black ministers in Virginia at the time. So you see whites helping with that by ordaining black ministers. You see white churches helping with setting up constitutions for black churches and helping them set up their own governments in their churches. So you see a whole lot of just almost surreal examples of separation, either on hostile terms or on these cordial terms. And it really matters from church to church and even from family to family and individual to individual what this looked like, whether it was a positive or negative or just a mixture.
And with our time that we have left, Nancy, share with our listeners, please, what's the evolution of the black churches after the Civil War?
Yeah, well, and I can only speak to a decade or two after the war. My research really doesn't extend beyond the late 1870s. So, I guess about a decade toward the very end of Reconstruction. And at that point, I have had some readers who've read my manuscript said, oh, you should take it farther on. But that's a whole other research topic, and that would be a lot to take on. And I will also say that one of the particular challenges for me as a historian on this topic is that I admit that I'm always on the outside looking in. Mm-hmm. One, because of the gap in time. So it was a long time ago. And so accessing these sources, having to view them in a certain context that maybe is a little bit less familiar to me based on the chronological gap. And of course, I admit race. Like, I am not an African-American person. I am a white woman. And viewing these sources and viewing church life and what church life meant and means to black people, both back then and today, I'm always kind of on the outside looking in. And I've had some really great conversations with African Americans who come and see me at a conference talk and who come up and give me great feedback and are really helpful in helping me to understand that in a lot of ways I am an outsider. And so I have to kind of be careful in how I look at these situations. And so that is a particular challenge. But talking about the development of the Black Baptist Church, both before, during, and after the war, I had mentioned that there were several very robust black churches in Virginia, in this part of Virginia, before the war, in Richmond, in Petersburg, in Norfolk, and in Williamsburg. And those churches just continued to thrive and develop. There was a little bit of difficulty during the war just because of the violence in the area and the upset. If we talk about just what was going on militarily, it was hard for some churches to meet when there were battles and engagements and campaigns going on around them. But after the war, we see all of those churches really pick up and grow, and now growing with freed people in the full aspects of freedom. Black ministers now not having to navigate their way around these racial laws that said they couldn't preach, et cetera. Now those laws had been disbanded because of emancipation. But these black churches are still living with a lot of struggles against white racism in places like the cities and in the country churches as well. One scholar calls the Black Baptist Church a refuge in a hostile white world. And really that's what it became more and more as we get past Reconstruction and we see the violence that would ensue against black people in the South. The church more and more does become a refuge. It's a place for support, for helping one another, et cetera, of even advancing political campaigns, like many ministers became like Republican legislators, even in many local offices, but still trying to advance politically. And so it's just a refuge. It's a place that they feel safe against the Jim Crow that was essentially developing in the South. So it has so much meaning. But again, I talked about that tragedy of segregation that really grows and grows in amongst Baptists in the South and then across the country. Think about divisions for Christians in terms of race. And a lot of this has this legacy, this mixed legacy of celebrating emancipation, putting things as they always should have been in American history, but also the scars that have lasted for generations because of what happened in the churches and what happened in the larger social context.
And we understand that in spite of our sinful natures, God is continuing to broaden and spread his kingdom. And in your dissertation and your book, you are constantly, again, reminding us that God is still at work in spite of the human tragedies and debaucheries that we go through as human beings.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we only need to look to the Bible to see how God can use imperfect people and really awful situations and redeem them. And just thinking about, if we look through the Old Testament at how much Israel really failed in its covenant, in its relationship with God, but how God still advanced the gospel through Christ and advanced the gospel of repentance and of love and of Christian charity and Christian bonds. God is more powerful than our own sinful and horrible mistakes. And so, yes, I do see there, even just for some concrete examples, just even missionary efforts that went on, there was so much, as I mentioned, segregation. Black churches went one way and white churches went another way, but there's still these little bit of ties that carry over, particularly in terms of missionary work, that they're willing to work together. And there are some people that we're hoping for more fellowship and for more connection. I think those who were able to look past the racial issues, who were able to look beyond that. And you do see, it's really interesting to read what some of these black ministers wrote after the war, that they were kind of holding out their hand trying to say, like, do you want to join together and meet together in terms of these larger organizations? And in some cases, they're really rebuffed by the white leaders, but in other cases, there is an effort to join together, particularly on the question of missionary work.
Well, we could continue to discuss this topic. These are fascinating topics to discuss. So, Nancy, we would thank you for coming and sharing the principles of your dissertation. We pray and hope that your dissertation ultimately becomes a book, because this is such a fascinating topic that oftentimes we just simply overlook. So thank you for coming and sharing with us about Drawn Together, Drawn Apart, the Black and White Baptist churches in the Tidewater, Virginia. So thank you for coming and sharing with us again today.
Well, thank you so much, Marge. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Thank you. This is 1180 AM WFYL, working for your liberty.